very warm good afternoon. Uh, Thank you for the welcome. And the privilege is all mine. The honor is all mine. I'm glad to be here speaking at this prestigious Royal Global University here in Guwahati. I've been traversing through Guwahati when I travel to Arunachal Pradesh or to Shillong or to Dimapur, where we have some number of Tibetans there, but never stopped in Guwahati to speak with the universities or to interact with the public. So this is my first occasion, and I want to thank the university authorities for organizing this. In fact, I have also been doing quite a number of university rounds, starting from Oxford in UK, with some more universities in the UK, and my last engagement was at Harvard, where Madam had served before at the Harvard JFK Junior Forum in the Institute of Politics. We have only one Tibetan undergrad there who was responsible for working with other student union leaders to organize that event. So these are the engagements that we try to, go around the world and talk to people about China, about Tibet, and the intention of the Chinese government. Even in India, there are not many scholars on China, very few scholars on China. And when you are dealing with the government, particularly as a neighbor so close to you, it is very important that we understand the geopolitics of what is happening around us. I'm born in India. So in that sense, I'm an Indian. I call myself a Kannadiga because I can speak little Kannada and speak little Tamil because I grew up in the south. I've never seen my land, Tibet. So to fulfill my emotional needs, I traveled from Arunachal Pradesh to Ladakh, where we have smaller Tibetan communities. We have to look after their welfare as well as for my emotional needs to see Tibet from the Indian side. Um, so that is also one purpose of why I go on the Himalayas as often as I can. And to speak about Tibet, I have traveled to at least 27, 28 different countries so far in the last 4.5 years, and also keep learning every single day, keep reading every single day on what's happening around the world, globally, and the changing dynamics of global political situation, what China is doing with all the multilateral forums around the world, what is happening inside China, what Chinese are doing for Tibetans or against the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols that are occupied by China. But to get a better understanding of Tibet, even though Tibet lies not very far from Assam, and the Tibetan river, the Yalung Tsangpo, flows into your state as Brahmaputra or Xiang. There are not many Tibet. I would not think that there would be too many Assamese who study Tibet or the geopolitics of where Tibet is involved. And in fact, it is normally the norm when I travel to South America. They are focused more on the region, the Western Hemisphere, the North Americas and the South Americas. They hardly know much about Europe and less about Asia. So it's very important for us to travel around and tell the world what China is doing. And to give you an overview of Tibet, for those who don't know much about Tibet, these are some basic information from satellite images now we can make out in the next map. I keep saying we don't need to draw a boundary around Tibet. Tibet has a natural geographical boundary that defines itself, because Tibet emerged as because of the tectonic shift between the Gondwanas, which is the Indian plate, and the Eurasian plate some 50 million years ago. So which means 50 million years ago, Tibet also had a beach on its southern border, which could be around these areas. If you look at the Himalayan region, mountains in the Himalayas, you will find a lot of sand and pebbles instead of hard rock that forms the mountains. And we call our land as the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges because it's the highest plateau and the biggest plateau on Earth. It happened, I keep mentioning about the tectonic shift because it's still continuing. And as per a geological report just few days ago, it still talks about the continuing tectonic shift of the Indian plate going underneath the Tibetan plate, which is the Eurasian plate, and the Himalayas still growing by about 10 millimeters every year. And the human habitation on the Tibetan plateau dates back to about 30,000 years ago. That is the latest finding. If there are more findings of human habitation going back older days, then that will also be mentioned. But that's what the scientists say today. This shows you the elevation of Tibet compared to the region. And then Westerners started coming to Tibet around late 16th centuries from Europe and maybe in 19th century from North America. They started calling Tibet the roof of the world because of its altitude. Because Tibet's altitude is about 4,880 meters or 16,010 feet. That's the average altitude of Tibet above sea level. And according to NASA, it's the highest plateau and the biggest plateau on Earth, but unfortunately, the biggest open air prison of this world today. It's home to Mount Everest, as we all know, 8,848 meters, and Tibet has a size of 2.5 million square kilometers, which is about 25% of China's total land mass, or two-thirds of India, or bigger than Mexico, 10 times the size of UK, or 16 times the size of Japan. So Tibet is not a small country, it's a big country. One time I was asked whether by a journalist, which is bigger, Tibet or Bhutan? So that speaks for the journalist because he has never understood or looked at the map of how big Tibet is. But then again, it's very sparsely populated. It's only about 7.5 million Tibetans inside Tibet today if we look at the latest census of the Chinese government in 2020. But the numbers coming from the Chinese government are not always reliable. And there are also not many means that we can verify those numbers, but it's estimated that there are about 7.5 million Tibetans inside Tibet today. Then, now, I think the first person who coined the third pole for Tibet was way back sometime in 1932, but the word didn't get as much traction as it's getting today. So today, even Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole because aside from North Pole and South Pole, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. So we are talking about the next screen. We are talking about Tibet being its largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost outside the Arctic and Antarctic, and it has about 46,000 glaciers according to UNEP, and it holds about 14,500 cubic kilometers of ice that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. That's according to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and some call it Tibet's weather climatic conditions are crucial for global climate regulation because some call Tibet as the rainmaker. Because of the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau and the impact of El Nino, which is the warming up of Pacific, it decides as to where monsoon would be in India, which are going to be the hotspots where the depression is going to set in. So Tibet is called the rainmaker of Asia. And because of the melting of ice on the Tibetan plateau, which is twice the speed of normal average around the world, of course, is 3 times more in the North and South Pole, this is also contributing to heat waves in Europe. Now you will see more and more heat waves in Europe because there is melting of more ice on the Tibetan plateau. And I traveled to Brazil some 2-3 years ago, and just before going there, I read a scientific journal which talks about the correlation between the Amazonia, which is the lung of the world, and Tibet, the roof of the world. The climatologists who studied this over a period of time, they found this correlation that when there is more rain in Amazonia, there is less snow in Tibet. And when there's more snow in Tibet, there's less rain in Amazonia. So we live in a very interdependent world, even climatologically, we are all linked. Anything that happens in one part of the world has its impact on the other parts of the world. And this is also one example of, even though we are 20,000 kilometers apart, there are correlations between climatic conditions of different regions, particularly with the roof of the world. And the geostrategic importance of Tibet. Tibet has always been a buffer between the now what has become the two most populous nations in the world, China and India. Because historically, Tibet has been an independent country. We have never ever been directly ruled by any other country, including China. So if we have a recorded history of more than 2,200 years, and I was asked once in Melbourne to speak about India-Tibet connection, and our friend, Member of Parliament in the Australian Parliament, Lisa Singh, she started from 7th century, and I went back 9 centuries before that, to 127 BC, where the first Tibetan king, there are several versions of from where this king came from. And the two versions are that one is that the first Tibetan king was a prince from Bengal, a deformed king who had webs. And another says it's a lost Kaurav prince who came into Tibet. But whatever the different sources, there seemed to be a connection between ancient Tibet and ancient India. So Tibet became a major power in Central Asia between 7th to 9th century when we dethroned the Tang emperor, went up to Samarkand in the present-day Uzbekistan. That used to be the extent of Tibetan Empire at one time. Then we went through 400 years of disintegration. But when Tibet was a huge empire, the Tibetan first religious king of Tibet, Songtsen Gampo, in 7th century sent his minister to India to invent a new Tibetan script. So the Tibetan script that we use today, if I read the consonants, you will find it's very similar to Hindi because it's ka ka khanga, cha cha chanya, ta 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 na, pa 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 ma, cha cha zawa, shasa aya, rala shasa, ha a. So we have 30 consonants, only 4 vowels. You have more vowels in Hindi. Right? So the language Tibetan language came from Devanagari script of the Gupta period. And in 8th century, then again, we had some Chinese monks because Buddhism went to China before it came to Tibet in 3rd, 4th century. You have the visitors from China also to India. And Buddhism came to Tibet in 7th century, but the teachings were not there. The real teaching started from 8th century when we invited Padmasambhava and Shantarakshita to teach Buddhism in Tibet. And from that time onwards, till now, we have been devout Buddhists for the last more than 1,300 years. China today claims that Buddhism went from China to Central Asia to Tibet and other countries. That is not reality. China is very good in lying about everything, using soft power as a means of gaining, increasing its relationship with other countries. But we have to set the record straight. The Tibetan Buddhism came from the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism in India. And between 8th to 13th century, we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan. So today, Tibetan language is the only language, if you want to study Buddhism in its entirety, Tibetan is the only language. And just recently, about 2 years ago, one of our monks worked with some 300 scholars and came out with a Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary, which is 223 volumes long. It has become the most voluminous dictionary in the world. We presented one to the Library of Congress in the United States and also one to the Czech National Library as a part of their collection. So we did that, and connecting here in this region, I was seeing in 1206, Bakhtiyar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet from northeast India, but only 100 returned back. So that also speaks for Tibet's might, even after 400 years of disintegration when Tibet was ruled by chieftains and kings in different regions, our borders were well protected. Then 13th century, Mongolia became a big power with Genghis Khan coming into the scene, and then Tibetans surrendered in the early 13th century because Mongols were merciless. They had no religion. They used to kill, decimate people, and make sure that the next place of conquest is surrendered much before they arrived there. That's why they were seeking a spiritual master, which they found it in the form of Sikyong Penpa Tsering in Tibet. And then from that time onwards, we developed this priest-patron relationship between the Mongols and the Tibetans. And then only after that, from 1271 onwards, Kublai Khan invaded China. We already had relations with the Mongols. Kublai Khan invaded China from 1271 and occupied the whole of China by 1278. And this period when Mongols ruled China, from 1271 to 1368, it is called the Yuan period in Chinese history. But the Mongols were there even before that. Mongols were there even after that. Our relations were more with the Mongols than the Chinese, till up to 1720. When China was, the Mongols were overthrown by the Ming dynasty in China in 1368. And when Ming ruled China from 1368 to 1644, Tibet didn't have much political relation with the Ming Chinese. The Mings are the real Han Chinese. Then the Mings were overthrown by the Qings, who are Manchus. If you watch Chinese kung fu movies, you will find that Manchus are always the Dakus, the antagonists, and the protagonists are all Chinese. That shows that the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. So Manchus were most powerful between 1735 to 1795 for about 60 years. And that was the period when Tibet came under some kind of influence of the Manchus. Then Manchus, they themselves had to suffer from 1830s when the Opium War started and there was this colonization of China, and Chinese leaders even today talk about 100 years of humiliation. When the Chinese themselves were not able to rule themselves, how can they assert or exert their control over Tibet? Then beginning of last century, we were attacked by British India in 1904 by the Young Husband expedition. They came up to Lhasa. They killed quite a number of Tibetans who were resisting their moves into Lhasa. But there were no Manchus to defend us. Where were the Chinese? If they claimed that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, there was no Chinese to defend Tibet in 1904. We were again attacked from the northeastern Tibet, where my father comes from, by the warlord called Mabufang, and eastern Tibet in Kham, they were invaded by the Chinese Qing generals. And the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia. He had to flee to China also till about December of 1909. Then he came to Tibet. 3 months after that, the Chinese were again on the eastern front, and the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee into India in 1910. And he was in exile for 2 years. We went back to Tibet in 1912 after the fall of Qing dynasty, and then reasserted our independence with the Mongols in 1913. And then we signed the 1914 Shimla Agreement, which defines the McMahon Line, which is present border between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet. And we signed as an independent nation. There was the plenipotentiary of the Chinese government, but they did not ratify the agreement in the end. So we were responsible for, as an independent country, to set this border with India. Then we had our relations with the nationalist movement, with the KMT, the Kuomintang, up to 1949. Then the Chinese Communist Party came into being in 1949, and they started invading from eastern Tibet. By 1950, October, there was already 40,000 Chinese army on the Tibetan frontier called Chamdo. With just 10,000 Tibetan army, they defeated the Tibetans. And then the 14th Dalai Lama had to take over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet at the age of 15 in 1950, 17th November 1950. Just a few days ago on Monday, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of His Holiness assuming the temporal and political leadership of Tibet. And that was when Tibet was independent. 6 months after that, we were forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement under the threat of war and also personal safety of the people who were there in Beijing. And the seal of the Tibetan government was with His Holiness in Yatung, because His Holiness had to come to the Indian border just in case China comes in, and he had to seek political asylum in India. But eventually he returned back to Tibet and tried to live under the provisions of the 17-point agreement, which also provided for quite a good amount of autonomy, not like what is being practiced in Tibet today. It also talks about the preservation of the institution of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama as the political leaders. So China, in the beginning, were very warm, very nice. Tibetans also sang songs in praise of the Chinese. And then they showed their true color in few years. And they trampled on every provision of the 17-point agreement, which made it impossible for His Holiness to live in Tibet. In between, His Holiness in 54, 55, at the age of 19, 20, was in China. He saw how communist government functioned. Everything looked very orderly, but people didn't have the freedom to speak their mind. Then 56, 57, His Holiness was in India for the 2500 Buddha Jayanti, and he also visited the Indian Parliament just 10 years into Indian democracy, very nascent democracy. 10 years after independence, everything looked very chaotic, but people had the freedom to speak their mind. And that is why His Holiness was moved, and he became a true democrat all his life, and also a visionary. So we had to come into exile in 1959 from Arunachal Pradesh, and His Holiness was in Tezpur to meet with the international media for the first time after losing independence, after having to come into exile. Then he established the government in exile. Of course, Indian government was not happy in the beginning, but then we persisted. So His Holiness, not even 1 year after coming into exile, introduced democracy in exile. And that's also the reason why an ordinary person like me could be in this position today. So His Holiness, his vision, everybody thought that we don't have to live in exile for so long. Everybody thought we will return back very soon, but then it has already been 65 years now, right? So this is just to give you an overview. Today we have our government in exile only because of the largesse of the Indian government. If it is not for the government of India and people of India, we don't exist as a government in exile. We don't exist as a government in exile with a fully functional democratic polity that does not exist in any other communities in this world. So we have become an example, a model for governance in exile. I just spoke at Harvard JFK Forum on Democracy in Exile, Governance Without a State, on this topic. So this is just to give you an overview of how we function from Dharamsala. We have our own Supreme Justice Commission. That functions more like an arbitration because we don't handle criminal cases because we live in India and we have to conform to Indian laws. Then we also have a parliament of 45 members, a cabinet of 7 members, plus the Sikyong 8 members, with departments like home, religion and culture, education, health, finance, security, and information and international relations. We also have our election commission for my post, for the post that I hold, and for the parliament. We hold elections once in 5 years in 26 different countries in the world in one day, all over the world. This is an experiment by itself. When my moderator, Ned Price, said he mentioned Tibet as a project, the Tibetan democratic polity as a project. So if this can be considered as a project, it is a project that has been serving the Tibetan community well and could set an example for many other communities around the world who suffer like us. So with this, I come to the present day situation where we talk about the situation in Tibet. There is no political freedom whatsoever that you take it for granted in democratic India. It's more like, if you have read George Orwell's 1984, it's more like George Orwell's 1984 having come into reality in the whole of China, and more particularly in Tibet and East Turkestan and Mongolia, because the state surveils and controls everything. The state takes DNA samples of all the Tibetans, iris scanning of all the Tibetans, the facial recognition. You will see lines of CCTVs around the monasteries because they take pictures from all angles and they can find you anywhere. 157 Tibetans have self-immolated between 2009 to 2022, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue. But unfortunately, no. In 1963, when there was one self-immolation in Vietnam by a monk, it became international news. 68 in Czech Republic, it became international news. But even after 157 self-immolations inside Tibet, where China is very good in hiding evidence of what has happened, there is not much movement on the Tibetan front. So that is why, and these people, most of the self-immolators are between the age of 17 to 35, and it's a very thin line between violence and non-violence when it comes to self-immolation. It's the motivation that defines your act. And these people have never seen independent Tibet. They have never witnessed independent Tibet before 1949-50. And they have never witnessed the 10 long years of cultural revolution that the Chinese Red Army inflicted on the Chinese people and more so on the Tibetan people. 1.2 million Tibetans died as a direct or indirect result of China's occupation of Tibet. And some 6,000 Tibetan monasteries were destroyed by the communist China. So even under those very difficult circumstances, even though Tibet was an independent country, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, started thinking about a mutually beneficial solution starting from 1973 onwards, what is now known as the middle way policy of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. He proposed that, we took it to the public, the larger number of Tibetans supported that, and then we took it to the parliament. It was a unanimous decision by the Tibetan parliament in exile, and His Holiness reiterated his commitment to the middle way, which is a Buddhist concept. And when we say middle, there are ends to it. So one end is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, and the other end is the present condition of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. So when we talk about resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, of course, there can be a peaceful resolution only by talking with the Chinese leadership. But unfortunately, the present Chinese leadership does not have any common sense. So that's why I keep saying, if you have good hospitals, when I travel around the world, I ask them, if you have good hospitals, we'll bring the Chinese leaders one by one, do surgery, put common sense and send them back. That's all they need. Because we have addressed their major concern of sovereignty. You know, for China, sovereignty is a big, big issue. We have addressed their major concern, but still they are not yielding. Because unfortunately, communism is, as one of the socialist Indian leaders said, communism is built on foundation of lies. So they have to tell more and more lies to cover more and more lies all the time. You know, so when His Holiness talks about this middle way, when I came into this position, we of course are committed to finding a non-violent solution, a mutually beneficial solution, a negotiated solution that would be lasting. Because if you look at the conflicts that are going around in the world today, you don't know whether you are resolving one problem or are you creating more problems for future. Right? So non-violence is the only means. But we changed the strategy a little bit to focus on the ends rather than the middle way, to gain leverage and value for the middle way. If there's no recognition for the ends, then middle way doesn't make sense. So that is why we changed our strategy, and we worked with the US Congress for the last 2 years, from 22 to 24, to get this Resolve Tibet Act passed, which is very much in line with how we are trying to take the Tibet movement forward. So by changing the strategy, focusing on the historical status of Tibet as an independent state and seeking recognition from governments, we believe will force the Chinese government to come on the negotiating table with us. So that is why, and one reason for focusing on the historical status of Tibet is also to send a clear message to China and to the international community that you cannot change history. Whether it's in the life of a person, yesterday was history. In the life of a nation also, yesterday was history. You just can't change history on the whims and fancies of some politicians. It has to be based on facts, right? So we focus on that. We send this clear message to the Chinese government that you cannot distort Tibetan history. You cannot disinform the international community about Tibetan history. This is one area. And the second area is to the international community, because China forces every other government to say that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. So if Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, as Chinese government keeps saying, then why do they need to ask every other government to say Tibet is part of People's Republic of China? And when governments keep repeating these statements, then I keep telling them that, you know, you're going against international law. Because the invasion of China is of Tibet by China is by force. And according to international law, it's null and void. And what's happening to Ukraine today because of Russia's invasion and what China did to Tibet 75 years ago is the same, under the same international law. There are no two international laws. And the second thing we tell governments is that on the one hand, they keep saying we support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. And on the other hand, they keep saying Tibet is part of PRC. Then I tell them, your positions are contradicting each other. When governments keep saying Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? And every government recognizes that. So now we have to make governments aware of it. That's also the reason why we moved this Resolve Tibet Act, which talks about, because China says that there is no Tibet problem. So if there's no Tibet problem, if Tibet is a socialist paradise, then why don't you allow other people to see the paradise for themselves, to find out whether it's a paradise or a hell? So this law says that Sino-Tibet dispute is yet to be resolved conflict. And the second part of this law talks about the right of Tibetan people's right to self-determination, which is very much in line with the 1961 General Assembly resolution on Tibet, when we reached out to UN in 59, 61, and 65. After that, we never reached out. Today, we consider UN as a human body without legs and arms. It's the most undemocratic institution in the world, maybe next to FIFA. So that's how we try to reach out. And for the Tibetan population also, it's very important for us to understand our own history. For independent countries, there's so much focus on history. When we lost our country, then we should be focusing more on our history and bring the Tibetan community together. And that is some of the things that we have been doing over the years, and that's how we are trying to reach out to the international community. Now we have to work more with the democratic countries in Europe. This year we celebrated His Holiness' 90th birthday, and we are celebrating the whole year as a year of compassion, because the message of compassion and nonviolence is very, very essential in this world that's rooted in ancient Indian wisdom. So as a celebration of that, we also keep reminding of what His Holiness has been saying. His messages are very simple. One, he always says, I am one among 8 billion people in this world. So my job is to promote moral values, human values, not based on a particular religion. That's why he developed courses like SEE learning, SEE, social, emotional, and ethical learning. I know of institutes who talk about social and emotional learning, but there is no ethical in that. So I remember His Holiness, once a British politician came to meet with His Holiness, and his first question was, Your Holiness, we have so much problem with our youth today. And His Holiness' response was, everything is wrong with modern education because too much focus on materialism and not much focus on warm-heartedness and compassion and all these values that we talk about. So from my perspective, I think this is one of His Holiness' greatest contribution to humanity in the form of this education, a secular approach to education, not dependent on a particular religion, whereas appreciating all the good things of a believer or a non-believer for that matter. And the second commitment His Holiness says is, I'm a simple Buddhist monk. He's a practicing Buddhist. Just as there is no one medicine for 100 sicknesses, you have different religions to cater to people with different mental dispositions and inclinations. Right? So his mantra is, you practice your own religion, but respect all other religions. Then only you can bring peace, religious harmony. He has led and participated in so many religious harmony conferences that he has friends across religions. Then his third commitment is Tibet. Again, going back to Tibet, the strategic importance of Tibet by its location in the center of Asia, and the environmental importance of Tibet, and also the importance of Tibet as a Buddhist culture based on nonviolence and compassion, again rooted in ancient Indian wisdom. So these are civilizations that are worth protecting. If it is a custom or a heritage that is not worth protecting, it's okay. But we have the potential to spread more peace and harmony in this world through the teachings of the Buddha and the practices that we have been undertaking over the last so many centuries. Right? And then his fourth commitment is ancient Indian wisdom. That is why he's starting an institute in Bodh Gaya to study ancient Indian wisdom. That's on, whether it's on quantum physics or whether it's psychology. Even today, His Holiness sometimes used to say, modern psychology compared to ancient Indian psychology is like kindergarten, because ancient Indian psychology is very, very deep. So these are some of His Holiness commitments, and sometimes we I don't know how much you study China. Some countries regard China as a monolith, a big power that cannot be disrupted. It's not like that. China also has a lot of soft underbellies. Right now, you must have read about the housing collapse, which constitutes about 25 to 30% of China's GDP. It's not a small amount, it's a huge amount. You're talking about a 19 trillion economy. The first is United States with 30 trillion, and the second is China. And India is just about $5 trillion economy. So it's a huge economy, and when you have a failed housing initiative, closing down all these big companies, that speaks for China's economy. Now China has stopped even subsidizing this, and there are also local government debts. Local governments are going bankrupt. Because earlier they make money by selling land, and the buildings were costly. Now building prices have gone down, land prices has gone down, and the local governments are not able to make as much money as they used to before. But the central government is not relieving them. They did give a stimulus of 1.1 trillion yuan, which is nothing. They need at least 8 trillion yuan to lift the local governments out of bankruptcy. They also have those problems. Then there's this huge unemployment problem. We're talking about 18 to 20% of young Chinese being unemployed, and that number comes to about 12 to 12.5 million young Chinese who are unemployed. Then also because of the tariff war, there are more unemployment coming up. Every year you have new graduates of 11 to 12 million Chinese that has to be given jobs. But because of the one child policy that went on for too long, Chinese youngsters have lost value. Now the government is encouraging people to have more children, but young Chinese don't want to have children. They lost their moral compass. There is a huge vacuum of spirituality. So they keep saying, oh, you get married, you produce one child, so whatever your earnings are, you have to spend on that child. Why do you need to spend that much on a child? And there is these concepts like lie flat, where young people don't do anything, not work. So there are a lot of problems. Aging population. According to some estimates, in the next 50 years, 100 years, China's population can go down by half. So there are so many problems in China which are not explicitly visible to us because China's economy is export-oriented. If you look at the numbers, the domestic consumption is not increasing at all because they have seen their income go down during the 3 years of lockdown, and then the government being able to make U-turn decisions. And now China is the only country that has a deflationary trend. Every other country has inflationary trend. There is so much deflation because of overcapacity and fight over prices, competition. That also has a cyclical impact on the economy because people will be earning less and they won't have that much money to spend. The China's domestic consumption is only about 40 to 45% compared to 60, 70% of the developing world. So China has to depend on exports. Now that United States puts up these tariffs, they need more markets to sell their overcapacity. You have these electric vehicles which they produce in millions. So United States have put up tariff of 100%, Canada has put up 100%, European Union has put 34.5%, Brazil has, but now their EV markets are mainly Thailand and Brazil outside the developed countries. So China is looking at global south as a market. But again, the question is how much purchasing power does the global south have? And if you listen to the Southeast Asian foreign ministers, finance ministers, or in Europe, they are already seeing increase of 20 to 30% imports from China since United States introduced tariff on China. And this is causing big problems for these upcoming countries, the developing countries, because all their small and medium-scale industries will be killed by Chinese products. I was in Mexico. Mexico buys in only about 15, 20 billion. And they sell only 15, 20 billion to China and buy 130 billion from China. And I mentioned about 300 billion plus trade deficit of United States with China. The 27 EU countries have 400 billion. You add up all this, goes to more than $1 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserve for China, because of which they splurge it on space technology, they splurge it on military, on artificial intelligence, on robotics, on dual-use technology that sustains the war in Ukraine, and the Belt and Road initiatives. There's a new study by an aid data company, an institution in the United States about Chinese investments outside. Everybody thought that China is investing in the developing countries in the global south. But they found that that's not the case. Only about 43% of the investment went to global south, including the Belt and Road initiative. But more than 50% of the investments are still in developed countries. So you have to understand China's moves everywhere. Because of China's hegemonic ambitions, Japan has to spend more now. Japan is from Shinzo Abe's time, they changed their policy from a pacifist to now to having to defend their country and spend more money on defense. Australia, New Zealand were the playgrounds for China. They first experimented in Australia and New Zealand how to influence the Western world. Because they are Western world, they are Western democracies, but they are physically way off from the other Western countries. So when I visited New Zealand, nobody was willing to speak about China because all the intellectuals, business people, financials, everybody's fingers and toes are with China. Now they realize that China is becoming a security threat for New Zealand because they are hacking into the parliament website and all that. So the Five Eyes are coming together to monitor China's hacking and indulgence in their countries. Australia, for the first time, is spending about $376 million to buy 7 nuclear submarines. To defend against whom? China. Philippines have this perennial problem with China over the Scarborough Shoals. And then the other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, they all have problems with the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands, with China drawing up these 9 dash lines, which defines all the coastal areas also part of China. So this is creating a lot of problems. You look at India. A few years back, India never spent so much money on developing the border areas. Now, if you go from Arunachal Pradesh to Ladakh, you can see how much money Indian government is putting in to protect the Himalayas. So it's all because of China's hegemonic ambitions. And through Belt and Road Initiative, when China is not able to pay back the loans, then they take over strategic areas. We have already seen the Sihanoukville port, a part of Sihanoukville port taken over by the Chinese because the Cambodian government is not able to pay back the loans. They have already taken over the Coco Islands in Burma. Now you try to understand what China is trying to do within Burma, between the juntas and the rebel army, to play with the rare earth and other income systems. Payment systems are also now coming under the radar of Chinese government. That's also the reason why you don't have a solution in Burma right now, because everybody is dependent on China to continue with their agenda. So, and then again in Sri Lanka, I'm sure you all must have read about all this, because China built the port and the seaport, promising that there would be a lot of business through the maritime Silk Road. For South Indians, security was never an issue because security always used to be concerned in the Himalayas or with Pakistan. Today, maritime security is a big issue because China is sending a lot of ships to monitor the undersea cables and the telecommunications that are happening under the sea. So it is a huge concern even for South Indians now. And having taken over the Hambantota port by the Chinese authorities just because Sri Lanka is not able to pay back the loans is a huge security risk for India. And we have seen the developments in Maldives with President Muji coming in and trying to, crank up the relationship with China. Now I think they realize better. If you consider India as a frying pan, then when you deal with China, you are jumping into the fire cauldron. And China's influence in the Pacific Islands of Solomon and all those Marshall Islands, and now China having taken over the Gwadar port in Pakistan, in Balochistan, south of Pakistan, that also imperils the other project, the China Economic Pakistan Corridor, the CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Just last week, I heard a Pakistani minister saying that the CPEC is not helping Pakistanis at all. And this is coming from a Pakistani politician. That gives access for China over the whole of Arabian Sea through the Gwadar port and connecting Gwadar with mainland China through Xinjiang. And then China's relationship with Iran. China having taken over part of the Djibouti port, which could also be an army base for China if there has to be a war in the Middle East. And you look at all the stuff in the African countries also where China has invested in infrastructure, telecommunication, ports, all that. Now the African countries realize that they are not able to pay back the loans. So last year, 20 representatives from 20 African countries went to China to rework on their loan repayment. And same things are happening in Latin America. So China's arms are increasing, their tentacles are everywhere, and we should not take China's words for lightly, because at one time during Deng Xiaoping's time, you should hide your strength. Even if you are strong, don't show you are strong. Now, right now, under Xi Jinping, they are becoming brazen. Look at the developments with Japan over the last 1 or 2 weeks. A consul officer, consul general in Osaka is able to say that the head of the Prime Minister of Japan needs to be cut off because she made a statement on Taiwan. How brazen can you be? Diplomats are not supposed to say these dirty words. They are supposed to increase and improve relations between countries. And that is backed by the Chinese government and the Chinese official mouthpieces like Global Times and China Youth Daily and all the things that they came out in support with the diplomat who did this. So China's wolf warriors seem to be coming back. So if you look at all the things that China is doing, then we get a better idea of how much we need to deal with China. My concern is, some of our friends in Europe say, oh, the dragon is biting at us, dragon meaning China. And I keep telling them, dragon at one time was very weak. It was not in any position to bite anybody. But it's all of us, the Americans, the Europeans, Taiwanese, Japanese, who are all responsible for making China big today because of their investment. That's why I keep saying you don't have to read too many books, just read one book, Kissinger on China, as to how much America helped China for what it is today. Now, knowing that the dragon is biting at you, if you still keep feeding the dragon, then whose fault is it? And China will respect only strength, not weakness. If democratic countries are not able to stand up for their values, then China will never respect you. I also tell our friends, right now you are on your 2 legs. The more China asks you to kowtow, bend your body, kowtow, you will be on your 4th. You will become a donkey. Then China will keep riding you because that's how China functions. China, when it comes to the United States, the United States is not treating us equal. But when China is dealing with India, do you think China is treating India as an equal? Not at all. So they have 2 standards all the time. In the functioning of the government also, you have the Communist Party apparatus, then you have the People's Congresses. The final authority lies with the Communist Party. Since Xi Jinping came into power, the government departments are just namesake. It's the commissions behind every government body that decides, that takes the major decisions. Within China also on domestic issues, it's the Communist Party that decides everything, not the governmental organs. So you also have political commissars. If you watch China's politics over a longer period of time, then you will get this sense that there are bigger, there are symptoms of a bigger malaise that is happening. Because just last month, 2 months ago, they removed 9 generals. The second highest general, He Weidong, and the political commissar, Mei Hua, they were removed, along with 7 other generals. One is responsible for East China, one is responsible for South China. So that's why sometimes I get asked questions, do you think China will attack Taiwan now? I say China is not ready yet, because they have a lot of troubles. The people in the rocket forces who are responsible for missile technologies, who were appointed by President Xi Jinping himself, are being removed by him. Whether it's being done by him or is he being coerced by other leaders to do this, we don't know. We are still trying to find out because the system is so opaque. But the paranoia is so much that within the 7 members of the Politburo, not 2 members have dinner together. Above the rank of deputy minister in China, you are talking about 1,000-strong leadership. Not more than 3 leaders can meet together without the permission of the president. Because if something happens to the government tomorrow, they could be accused of doing something behind the scenes. Now I understand that even in Tibet, at the mid-level staff also, not more than 3 can meet together. That's a level of paranoia. In the army also, it has gone back to the mindsets of Mao's time. Today, if a Chinese army wants to get married, his or her spouse has to be vetted by the government. That's how much fearful they are of who is going to dethrone them. So we have to watch everything, what China is doing in APEC, AP4, in SAC. No, SAC is no more as valid as it used to be. You have the ASEAN Plus, you have the SCO nations, you have the BRICS, you have the G20. So we watch what China is doing in all these multilateral forums, including the United Nations. When US backtracks, then China steps in. And they define human rights from the perspective how they want it to be understood. Now China is not talking only about domestic issues. They are talking about a global security initiative, global civilizational initiative, global cultural initiatives. Just last month, in September, China came out with a global governance initiative. If that is the case, if China wants to export its system of governance to the rest of the world, would India like to be an authoritarian state? No. But they have these ambitions. We cannot take it lightly because they always come with a plan. Despite all the troubles they have, they're still trying to assert its influence in the region, which is not very good for all our neighbors. They speak about harmony, but they do something else. So I will end here. Of course, there's a lot of things that I can speak for hours and hours on global politics, on geostrategic, geoeconomic issues, but I think within this limited time, I want to thank the authorities here, the registrars. I understand that the Vice Chancellor and the Chancellor are not in town, but again, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity and to focus on nonviolence. I keep telling the Americans, nonviolence comes in millions, violence comes in billions. So you have to choose which one you want to do. And if there has to be true solutions for global conflicts or regional conflicts, it has to be done through the nonviolent means. His Holiness appreciates the concept of European Union. And if that can be applied to European Union, then why not to Tibet with China? We don't have a Hanuman to lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Bay of Bengal. So whenever we get to go back to Tibet, we'll have to live with Chinese as neighbors. We will have to live with Nepalese, Bhutanese, and Indians as neighbors. Then if we have to live as neighbors, then why don't we live in peace with each other? Why do we have to keep fighting with each other as neighbors? That makes no sense. So I'll stop here, but we will never give up. We will never give up. Even if we are only 140,000 in exile, even if His Holiness is now has reached 90 years of age, he has enabled us to carry forward the movement, and we will continue to carry forward the movement. The only thing is we need a little more understanding from the global community, particularly from India. That is why I'm reaching out to the younger generation who are the leaders of tomorrow. Because the older generation knows a little bit about Tibet, but there's not much that they can do. Now it is in your hands how you shape your country in future, and it's very important for you to understand the geopolitics and understand your neighbors. That is why I came here to speak for Tibet and also to speak for you. Thank you very much.
Maybe take a few questions.